Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Kathy Macbeth and I'm the Director of Sales and Marketing for EcoEngineers. And today's webinar topic is low carbon fuel standard verification. Before we get started with the presentation, let's review just a few housekeeping items for today. This webinar is being recorded, so everyone in the audience will remain muted throughout the presentation. Please send your questions through the questions chat function, which can be found at the right-hand side of your screen marked questions. This will help us capture your questions, and we will respond to as many as possible at the end of today's presentation. We will also be sending a short survey out after the webinar, and your feedback would be much appreciated, as we're always looking for ways in which we can improve how we share knowledge with you. All attendees will receive a link to the recording in the days following the webinar. The presentation format is a panel discussion, which will be led by Natasha Bielstein, Regulatory Consultant and LCFS Program Manager. Natasha will be joined today by Randy Pratty, EcoEngineers Manager of Audit Services, and our Fuel Type Line of Business Managers. Karen Jones, Senior Regulatory Consultant and Account Manager to Petroleum Traders and Importers. Jim Ram, Director of Engineering and Line of Business Manager for Ethanol. Andrew Clapp, Regulatory Consultant and Line of Business Manager for Biodiesel. Brad Plima, Senior Engineer and Line of Business Manager for Renewable Natural Gas. And then Natasha will round out this discussion by addressing verification requirements for electricity and hydrogen. EcoEngineers is a renewable energy consulting firm specializing in clean energy regulations, including California's LCFS program. EcoEngineers has been engaged with LCFS verification regulatory development since 2016, and we hold a deep understanding of verification requirements. EcoEngineers has assisted with registration and preparation of more than 150 LCFS pathway projects. And we have a dedicated in-house California GREET modeling team that has submitted and successfully approved over 30 3.0 pathways. We submitted our first pathway approval on January 4, 2019, and we have developed a detailed conflict of interest process to ensure we are positioned to support you with verification services. EcoEngineers' in-house verification team is ready to support you. With that, I will turn this over to Natasha for today's presentation. Natasha?
Thank you, Kathy. So, like Kathy mentioned, my name is Natasha Bielstein. I'm a regulatory consultant here at EcoEngineers, working mostly with LCFS producers. So today we're going to walk through some LCFS program updates, and then we will walk through the verification implementation, as well as conflict of interest. Then we will have each of the members of the panel that Kathy just walked through go through some fuel-specific concerns, and then we'll go into our question and answer session. All right, so the newest version of the regulation. So the goal of the program was updated to reflect a reduction of GHG emissions by 20% by 2030. So California has attacked this goal by incentivizing the development of low carbon fuels. So two different ways they've done this. So making the program performance-based, giving more credit to advanced fuels that increase the amount of reductions. And then they have also intended the program to be fuel neutral, meaning that there's no fuel type specific goals, unlike the RFS, where you have your RINs that are dedicated to different types of fuel. So a credit is a credit. The LCFS has also been an example to programs worldwide. So, we know Oregon is very closely following California. We know that BC does have their own program that is modeled closely after. We know of other programs as well. So the updates that came with this newest version, one of the biggest being the transition to GREET 3.0. So a lot of producers have been seeing reductions when implementing this new model because there are improvements to the model as well as changes to the electric mix on the grid, reflecting more renewable electricity. There are more fuels that are included in the Tier 1 calculator. So previously, fuels like cellulosic, kernel fiber, ethanol were Tier 2 fuels. Now they're considered part of the Tier 1 calculator. The design-based pathway process was used previously unofficially to engage CARB. Now they have made an official process to engage CARB through and innovative processes, which allows them to review it with CARB, get some feedback, and while it's not a true CI score, it does allow for some engagement. Also notably that there's more lookup table values and more temporary pathway options as well. Another one of the bigger updates that has come with this newest version has been the carbon capture and sequestration, or CCS, because carbon capture and sequestration is quite a mouthful. So those credits are generated through the implementation of these projects. So in order to start a project application, CARB has asked that you engage them throughout the project process and that the project must comply both with the pathway regulations as well as the CCS regulations. So the amount of CO2 that is captured or that is sequestered by an alternative fuel producer can actually be used to improve the carbon intensity with the associated fuel pathway. So one really notable part of this, and the reason I wanted to mention this here, is that these projects must also undergo verification in order to receive credits. So looking at the new regulation and looking at a graphic is always a little bit easier. So we have our GREET 2.0 pathways. So those are going to expire at the end of 2020. GREET 3.0 applications, like Kathy mentioned, we have been submitting those since the beginning of this year, and we'll keep submitting them until CARB comes out with their next version, next model. The monitoring plan. So the monitoring plan is the plan that is used by the verification bodies in order to create the sampling plan, the verification plans, and we are recommending that producers get those in place during 2019, especially for those looking at carbon intensities, because any changes to your process, anything that could change your carbon intensity during this time, you want to make sure that you're tracking that. Validation by CARB. Well, I'll talk a little bit about validation in a minute, but just noting that CARB is doing that for 2019. And then in 2020 and going forth, the verification bodies will not only be responsible for verification, but also the validation of new fuel pathways. So with that little mention of the monitoring plan, I'm going to set up a little poll. Let's see who has their monitoring plan in place. And you could just send a little vote in and we'll talk a little bit about that. I'm seeing quite a few yeses. This is reassuring, but maybe a couple more no's. All right, I'll give everyone another couple seconds to vote. And with that, I'm going to close it and we can see how everyone did. So we're seeing 14% with yes. Awesome. Congratulations to you. The 86% with no. So if you are looking for help with that, please let us know. Kathy's going to talk a little bit more about that later, but know that you're going to need that in place starting in 2020. Moving on from there. All right. First time using that. It's always nice when technology works. All right. So I mentioned validation briefly. So I just wanted to walk through this because it is part of the verification process. So for Tier 1 pathways that don't get certified by CARB by the end of 2019, they will have to be reviewed by a third-party verification body. The verification body will complete the pathway validation. So expect them to play a similar role to CARB during the applications process. So a review of your model, a mandatory site visit, review of your supporting documentation and data, and any other submitted items. They will then issue a positive or qualified statement, and then CARB will conduct a completeness review of the submitted materials, and then CARB will make the decision of certification for the pathway. Notably for Tier 2, though, the process is flip-flopped. So CARB will do the initial review of the submitted information before the verification body review. And, I know there's some question as to why there's different processes, but their Tier 2 pathways generally are more complicated, and I think CARB wants to make sure that they're making sure that all the pathways that are approved are fitting their standards. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Randy Pratty, our audit manager, and he's going to talk more about verification and some other pieces.
Thank you, Natasha. Again, my name is Randy Pratty, audit manager for EcoEngineers. And EcoEngineers is looking forward to becoming an accredited verification body by CARB. And with that goal in mind, we will be sending our staff, our verifiers and lead verifiers to training in the fourth quarter. We also are excited about providing validation and verification services to the fuel producers and reporting entities. With that short intro, let's take a look at a verification process. The intent of verification services is to live up to a standard of a financial audit, which would provide credit integrity, certainty, and market stability for the program. Verification services are mandatory for entities who have approved fuel pathways and those entities that have reporting responsibilities. Verification statements will be issued by the verification body for those entities that hold the pathway and also the reporting responsibilities. And one of the main pieces of the verification process would be the verifying the carbon, the CI score. We'll be remodeling in order to verify the CI score. First verification report for 2020 is due on August 31st, 2021. As we look a little further into LCFS validation and verification requirements, as Natasha mentioned earlier, starting or beginning in 2020, entities will be responsible for engaging a third-party verification body to validate the fuel pathway applications. We'll include an initial review and a site visit, and concluding with the verification body issuing a positive or qualified positive validation statement to certify the pathway to proceed. If a adverse validation statement is issued, then the application would be denied. Ongoing verification services. There will be an annual site visit performed by a lead verifier and/or a verifier who will perform an observation at the facility. They'll observe the operations, they'll observe the monitoring equipment, and review documentation. Again, mentioned earlier, we will conduct a verification of the CI score and the components. We'll review the data collection and the data management systems, and review the methodologies and factors that are used to estimate the CI score. Upon completion of verification services, the verification body will issue a verification statement. Verification may occur on a quarterly or annual basis. Verification statements are not submitted after quarterly reviews, and quarterly reviews of CI data may only be included as part of the annual verification services. Now looking at the validation and verification results, before verification statements are issued, there has to be an independent review of the lead verifier work, and it has to be conducted again by an independent verifier who basically is performing a final check. After that independent review is completed, the verification body will issue a verification statement, which is similar to like an opinion and from a financial audit. A positive statement would be verification body found the data reviewed and resulting CI or credits deficits generated free of material misstatement and conforms to requirements. a qualified positive, the verification body has found errors which may or may not need to be corrected, but the errors do not result in a material misstatement. And an adverse statement would be a verification body found errors that result in material misstatements and does not conform to requirements. And now heading into conflict of interest. Conflict of interest provision applies to verification bodies, and they will need to assess any potential conflict of interest they may have with a potential producer or reporting entity. Here at EcoEngineers, we have developed an internal matrix to assess the conflict of interest with our potential clients. We look at the type of work and the dollars and cents to compare to make sure that we can stay under as a low conflict. There are certain carve-outs in the regulations that the verification body would not be conflicted if they would perform QAP audit work or third-party engineering services pursuant to the EPA RFS regulations. They've also outlined a phase-in period. This would pertain to certain high level of conflict items that may occur during the 5-year look-back period and meet 5 years prior to 2020, which is the start of the verification period. And if any of those type of items were to have occurred in the 5-year look-back, this would allow a medium level of conflict item during the first 3 years of verification. An example here would be if a firm assisted with a registration or modeling, this would be considered high level, but since this work was performed during the look-back period, this can be evaluated to be a medium level of conflict, and the verification body would be allowed to verify for 3 years, and then would have to rotate after the 3-year period. A low conflict, there would still need to be disclosures made if there were verification type services performed, such as QAP. A medium conflict will have to must disclose any of those items that would be in conflict and provide a mitigation plan. And an example here is if a firm has provided LCFS registration, then we would have to report that, and then we'd have to also disclose a mitigation plan. In this case, we would say we would use our separate verification staff to perform the verification services. A high conflict, this case we cannot verify, and some examples here would be if you're performing internal audits for an entity, or if this firm is directly involved in allocation of RINs or LCFS credits. And the last point here, CARB must approve all conflict of interest evaluations before a verification body can perform verification services. And with that, I will turn it over to Karen Jones, our Senior Regulatory Consultant here at EcoEngineers, and she will talk further about reporting entities.
Great, thanks, Randy. So yeah, I'm going to kick off the next portion of the webinar where we're going to talk about fuel-specific considerations. So we're going to have each account manager at EcoEngineers highlight how verification relates to their fuel type area of expertise, including ethanol, biodiesel, renewable diesel, renewable natural gas, hydrogen, and electricity. So I'm going to start off with talking about how verification is specific to reporting entities. And as an account manager at EcoEngineers, I do work with a lot of petroleum traders and importers who could be considered reporting entities. And I know this is kind of a large bucket, but reporting entities are really anyone who's submitting quarterly fuel transaction reports or crude oil quarterly volume reports on the LRT. Basically anyone who's generating credits or deficits on the LRT system. So like I said, this is a large bucket of people, but Specifically, I'd like to highlight an example, which would be a petroleum importer or a biofuel importer into the state of California, someone who is generating those credits or deficits on the LRT system. So that credit and deficit generation is required to be verified by a third party. And verification reports are due August 31st, 2021 for the year 2020. So any credit or deficit generation that happens during the year 2020 is required to be verified by a third party. That means for these entities, your monitoring plan needs to be in place starting January 1st, 2020. So it's time to get ready if you haven't done that yet. And that monitoring plan really should cover your credit and deficit generation, basically all of your procedures on how you're calculating, tracking, reporting, monitoring that credit or deficit generation that you're reporting to CARB. We're expecting that verification will include a site visit to the location where records are stored. And verification could be quarterly or annual, it's your choice, but regardless, verification can only begin after reporting is complete. So you would have to report quarterly, submit that report, and then engage the verifier to perform quarterly verification if that were the case that you would like to elect to. As a last point of comment and something that you should be aware of is that as the credit or deficit generator, you're responsible for the number of credits that or deficits that are generated. So it could be the case that, let's say you're a biofuel importer and you're not necessarily responsible for operating a biofuel plant out of California or responsible for the carbon intensity score of that plant operation, but you are the entity reporting what is the carbon intensity of that plant and how many credits should be generated. So if that upstream plant were to be found to be operating above their carbon intensity score, then you would be responsible as a credit generator to make the market whole and make sure that the credits are retired if you over-generated credits. So that's just something to keep in mind as you're preparing for verification. So if you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to me. And with that, I will turn it over to Jim Ram, who's going to talk about ethanol.
Thanks very much, Carol. I'm speaking as the ethanol line of business manager here at EcoEngineers and speaking to the verification opportunities and challenges presented to ethanol. I believe that ethanol is pretty organized as an industry in terms of plant information, in terms of accounting systems and marketing. And I think that ethanol can do a good job of applying for and doing a good job of participating in verification. So this applies to producers of ethanol, whether that's starch or cellulosic ethanol. And we have this GREET 3.0 Tier 1 calculator that's been set up for both starch and cellulosic ethanol. It offers reductions on average of 3 to 5 points when compared to GREET 2.0 on starch. So really, ethanol producers who are headed westward or headed to California, they really need to get their GREET 3.0 pathways opened up as soon as possible. So California is continuing to lead the way in improving pathways for kernel fiber, for D3 kernel fiber, for kernel fiber. And in many ways, California follows RFS testing methodologies and RFS definitions for in situ kernel fiber technologies. So understanding how LCFS and RFS processes work is important for this verification. So the other issue that's unique to ethanol is separate pathways are allowed by co-product type. So we could have separate ethanol CI scores for dried distillers grains, for modified distillers grains, and for wet distillers grains. So needing to keep track of all the documentation in order to mass balance and demonstrate the multiple pathways by co-product. Finally, I just want to mention that those who provide distillers corn oil into the biodiesel market should be prepared to support their downstream customers as a specified source feedstock provider. And with that, I'll turn it over to Andrew Clapp, regulatory consultant.
All right, thanks, Jim. As Jim said, I'm Andrew Clapp, regulatory consultant and biodiesel line of business manager. I'm going to touch on a couple of the main impacts of LCFS verification to biodiesel and renewable diesel facilities. Number one, and I don't think it's a surprise to any folks out there in the biodiesel, renewable diesel, or feedstock community, is the specified source feedstock piece that Jim touched on. And what CARB's looking for here from producers is that they are able to demonstrate chain of custody evidence in either one of two ways, either directly from the point of origin in case of shipments that come from, say, a rendering facility, or directly from an ethanol plant, or for folks who collect from restaurants in the form of BOLs, weighbridge tickets, etc. Or in the case of more of a used cooking oil aggregator, they're looking for material balances or energy balances from in between the first point of collection and the facility. So from your aggregator to each relevant point along that supply chain, so including storage and pretreatment, and even brokers as well, will need to have and maintain proper mass and energy balances to demonstrate feedstock types and feedstock quantities. That kind of leads us into point two, which is that any of those entities, an aggregator or a broker, could apply separately as a joint applicant. This would allow them to contract separately for verification services, submit CARB separately to, or submit documentation separately to CARB to be verified, which allows for protection of their business interests, confidentiality between themselves and producers to their customers, and potential competitors in some cases. Now, this is a pretty big change for industry as far as requirements for feedstock suppliers. What does this mean for feedstock suppliers? Feedstock suppliers who are already certified under other audit programs, ISCC or RSB, are going to be in a lot better position to meet the requirements of an LCFS verification process. Biofuels producers will want to ensure that within their monitoring plan, which you should be working on or have in place already, that you can demonstrate this chain of custody evidence in a way that'll meet the requirements of the program. And verifiers are charged with the responsibility of assessing risk based on monitoring plans, document reviews for each producer and each feedstock supplier. Therefore, the more prepared you are in advance, the smoother this will go for you. Working on your monitoring plan, working with your feedstock suppliers to ensure that they have the proper tracking, accounting capabilities, record keeping, in order to meet the traceability requirements of this new regulation. Another piece that's kind of tied in is the feedstock allocation to a fuel quantity. If you're using multiple feedstocks at your facility, CARB in the new regulation has set up a specific methodology for calculating your allocation of feedstock, and most importantly is you must utilize the yields for each feedstock based on your certification yields. So whatever you applied for and were certified for your pathway, for let's say use cooking oil yield, that is the yield you must use when allocating fuel to that feedstock. That means if you have an improved yield in a certain quarter, that extra biodiesel that technically may have been produced from used cooking oil would have to be applied to a higher CI feedstock pathway. All of this we can of course help you with. Reach out to us, feedstock suppliers, biofuels producers. We can help prepare you so that you can maintain your compliance and be ready for verification, and we can also be your verifier. With that, I'll pass it on to Brad Klima, our Senior Engineer and Renewable Natural Gas Line of Business Manager. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, my name's Brad Klima, Senior Engineer, work in the RNG industry primarily, and just wanted to spend a few minutes talking about the impact of verification on renewable natural gas. And many of the processes follow what Andrew and Karen have mentioned, but I think there's some, for RNG, the verification, at least at our initial look, is a more straightforward process than certainly with Andrew on the biodiesel, mentioned on the biodiesel side of all the feedstocks. While you're still going to have to verify feedstocks on the RNG side, it sets itself up just for a more straightforward verification process. And many of you, out-of-state providers, especially out-of-state of California, are following the book and claim process, where you inject into a pipeline outside of California and have a virtual contract or offtake within the state. The LCFS verification will follow that similar process that, say, the RFS QAP program follows, where we'll be verifying the various documents along that value chain and in that process to make sure all of the components match up and are in place. So we'll take a very similar approach to the RFS QAP from a document standpoint. Another difference, Natasha mentioned this earlier, there are many of the RNG pathways were switched from the Tier 2 pathway, specifically on the agricultural digester side, to Tier 1. So that is also a more straightforward modeling and a review process. There's also the implementation of temporary pathways, specifically for swine and dairy manure, that can be used while you're waiting for your pathway to be certified by CARB and by the and validated by the verifier as well. As Jim mentioned on the ethanol side, if you are providing RNG as a feedstock to other fuels, so for example, if you're supplying RNG to an ethanol plant to help lower their overall carbon intensity, you will have to be part of this verification process, because the verifier will have to go all the way back to the biogas production facility to do the verification alongside. It'll go hand in hand with the ethanol facility. But if you are a producer that is supplying a biogas or RNG to an ethanol plant, you'll have to work with the verification body and your purchaser as well. And then on the co-processing of various feedstock types, I know this has been a recent topic within the industry, people talking about CARB issued some recent guidance on co-processing of different feedstocks that we don't have time to go into in this webinar, but there is some guidance on CARB's website that you can go check out if your facility is co-processing. That guidance will help you with your compliance monitoring plan to fully detail that out. So when your verifier does go to review and verify that it's covered adequately in your compliance monitoring plan. Another Karen mentioned this earlier, is that in RNG, many times the production facility is not the credit generator. They may sell it to a CNG station or an importer or a marketer. And this is the importance of starting this process now and working on your compliance monitoring plan. And if you are either the credit generator or the RNG production facility, getting the team together to figure out who's going to do the compliance monitoring plan and making sure all the pieces fit well together will be very important, because again, that is going to be the main document that the verification team will review. So in the end, I think that probably is the biggest maybe complexity in RNG, is there are several different entities that you have to come together, have to find your verifier, work with your existing team and your structure to put together your compliance monitoring plan. And looking forward, again, we can help answer a lot of questions. We're working with a lot of RNG facilities on the modeling side as well. So we still do, while we're talking about verification, we still do modeling and pathway applications. And then we'll have to walk through, if we've done that with you, we'll have to walk through that conflict of interest process that Randy outlined as well. But in many times, we can still do up to 3 years of verification if we've worked with you on the monitoring or on the modeling or application side. And if not, we'd be happy to talk to you more about doing 6 years of verification. So thank you. I'm going to turn it back over to Natasha about hydrogen and electricity.
Thanks, Brad. So, in addition to my responsibilities at EcoEngineers working with LCFS, I also work with Brad with renewable natural gas producers as well as in electricity and hydrogen. So, I thought I'd walk through a couple of those considerations here as well. So, most notably, California is approving these pathways, and they've addressed the issue of double counting through looking through the lens of the fueling supply equipment. I know Brad talked a little bit about book and claim accounting, and that is relevant here because within the state of California and the balancing authority that is just a little bit outside the state, there is some allowance for book and claim accounting for electricity. And then to look at location matters. So for out of state, you can import RNG in and create hydrogen from that, which is also under that umbrella of book and claim accounting. So for feedstock, we'll be looking at especially the low CI sources. So when we look at the type of pathway for lookup versus tier 2, if you're looking at a low CI source or something that is outside of that lookup table requirement, you would be automatically required to do the tier 2 pathway. So in the end, who's responsible for this? So Brad, I know mentioned you have to get together with all your entities right now, but really thinking through, who's the first reporting entity? Is it that fueling supply equipment owner? Is it, the credit generator? And then who's the designated reporting entity if that's how your organization chooses to structure those agreements? And so with that, we're going to just do a little quick summary here. So we have a LCFS reporting table. So I just wanted to put these dates up there so we're aware of what the requirements are. So the producers are going to be required, and I'd also say the credit generation reporting entities will be responsible for an annual report that's due April 30th. If you look down at that annual verification report, about 4 lines below, that's when our report as a hopeful for verification party that's when our report is due. So any of those mandatory site visits will have to be done after your annual report is done and before that verification report is done. So there's not a very wide window. So if you are getting your reports in early, then that would be awesome, but we understand that might not always be the case. So also being mindful when you are looking for a verification party to ensure that you're contracting with them early, making sure that you have a commitment from them sooner than later so you can make sure that they are dedicated to providing that service for you. And with that, I'm going to pass everything back to Kathy before we launch into our Q&A. So get those questions in and we'll answer those shortly.
Great, thanks, Natasha. So next, we're just going to make a few recommendations here on what you should be doing now and talk a little bit about how we can help. So things that you should be working on now would, first be a great idea to start with reviewing the LCFS verification requirements or read the regulations. If Be working on your monitoring plan if you haven't started it. Request a conflict of interest determination. And then also, so you have your verifier in place by January 2020. And consider EcoEngineers modeling and verification capabilities. So how can we help? Well, there's a few things that we can do to help. Out of our consulting services group, we're offering an LCFS verification ready workshop where we can deliver to you everything from regulatory content to due diligence to a monitoring plan template to help guide you through and get you ready for verification services. If you have not updated your California GREET 2.0 to 3.0, you may consider that, and we're certainly happy to help with that as well and get your pathway up to date. If you just have questions about verification as a result of this webinar today and we didn't get a chance to respond to your question that you've submitted or something that comes up post this webinar, please feel free to reach out to your line of business manager. You can reach them through our phone number, which you can find on our website at .ecoengineers.us, or any one of the LOB managers here, first initial, last name at ecoengineers.us. You can reach them that way. And we'd be happy to do a couple of things. One, we'll send you a PDF of the LCFS verification regulations so you can review it, or we'll help with the determination letter. We can start that process, prepare a letter, and get it submitted to CARB so we can begin our association with you. And of course, we'd be happy to prepare a proposal for your consideration. With that, I'll turn it back to Natasha or open it up to the audience for Q&A.
Yeah, so before we launch into our Q&A, I'm going to put up one last poll, and that is around, as Kathy always says, do you feel verification ready? All right, so I'll wait a couple seconds for everyone to answer this one. All right. Knowing that, this was a brief webinar, but hopefully we're able to answer a couple questions in the upcoming question answer. And actually, while, everyone's putting their answers in, I do want to note that we will be answering some questions. However, CARB will be offering an official training for verification bodies. We're hoping for Q4 of next year. But please note, this year. 2020 is not here yet. So it'll be at the end of this year, we're hoping, and all of our questions that we're answering are up to our interpretation of the regulation, our experience in QAP, but I do want to always put that disclaimer that there's no actual verification bodies yet, but we do have a lot of verification body hopefuls. And with that, I'm going to close the poll and share our results. So I'd say about 1/4 feels verification ready, and I'm so excited for you, and hopefully I can answer a couple questions. For that 76% that doesn't feel verification ready, and if not, I'm going to put our emails up here, and we can get rolling on some of these questions. So Kathy mentioned these are our emails right here. So please feel free, reach out to whoever spoke to you the most. And with that, let's see some questions we got. All right. Wow. Okay. So how does CARB determine who will be the third-party validator, or does the applicant choose from a list? Randy, did you want to take this one?
Well, first of all, it's our understanding they have to be accredited by CARB. That's the first step. And then in order to get accreditation by CARB, the verification body would have to send their staff to training. So the appropriate staff, lead verifiers, would need to go and get trained. And I understand the training is scheduled in the Q4 to happen in the Q4 this year. And then once that has occurred, and then we would just seek accreditation from CARB.
Awesome. And another question, so is the site visit required for both validation and verification? And I will answer that one very quickly and say yes, it is required for both. Let's see, maybe, and if anyone on the panel, anyone in the room wants to answer these, jump in. All right. So, are you aware that Oregon DEQ has started a rulemaking to incorporate a verification program for both their GHG reporting rule and CFP, which is the Oregon version of the LCFS, the Low Carbon Fuel Standard for California? If so, is EcoEngineers planning to become a certified verification body in Oregon? I think Jim Rand's got this one.
Thanks, Natasha. So yes, we will become a certified verification body in Oregon. So for us, it's about creating efficient, effective means of verification. And so the RFS, the QRIN program, now the California verification, and we'll be headed to Oregon. And history on Oregon would suggest that they're going to adopt a lot of California. And so we would hope that it would be an efficient, equitable adjustment for the administrative reporting that's needed to add Oregon. So we're going to keep putting layers on here to keep markets open.
Thank you. Anyone else have anything to add to that? All right. So let's see, what's next? Do facilities need to be located in California to sell LCFS credits? Well, I'm going to answer that one with no. They don't need to be. They don't need to be located in California, but you do need to be registered with the California Air Resources Board, or CARB, to ensure that you are on their LCFS, their Low Carbon Fuel Standard reporting tool, their LRT system, to ensure that you can go in there and submit the reports necessary for credit generation, sales, and all of those activities. Let's see. We do have some very specific questions, and I will send those along to those who can best answer them. Okay, so can one company like EcoEngineers do the monitoring plan, LCFS verification, and third-party review? Does anyone have, Randy, you want to take that one?
Say that again.
Yeah, not a problem, not a problem. So can one company, EcoEngineers, do the monitoring plan, LCFS verification, and third-party review?
No, that would conflict us out. If we were doing a monitoring plan, that would conflict us out to doing, at least conflict us out for doing a 6-year, but potentially could be a 3-year verification for ECO.
Anyone else around the table on that one?
No, I think I've talked a lot on the RNG. This is Brad. On the RNG side before is we almost have to pick one or the other, because if you think about us as a verification body, we do both consulting and verification. We treat that here internally very strictly of from a staffing perspective. Randy's doing a lot of this conflict of interest engagement with CARB. But if we put together the monitoring plan, it's difficult for us to be the third-party verifier of that monitoring plan. And so what Randy mentioned on the RNG side, we've talked to a couple of people about their monitoring plan, and if we provide guidance, or if we've done modeling, or if we've done your pathway application, there is some limited guidance that we can provide around that and still do 3 years of verification. But we, as a verifier, to be a verifier, we can't, to my knowledge, write your monitoring plan for you.
That's right. Well, that's a good explanation, Brad, and I'll just add a little bit more detail around that, or clarification with regard to our LCFS verification ready workshops. So the workshops we're offering do provide regulatory download of regulatory requirements. We do provide an overview of the monitoring plan and some guidance on the monitoring plan to completeness. We're not developing the monitoring plan. We're not writing the monitoring plan. This is entirely allowed during the phase-in period, but it does establish a medium level of conflict for us and limits us to then 3 years of verification out of our verification team. And again, it's been said, we have our audit team here, which has its own management and organizational structure led by Randy, and then our consulting services division, which is led by Jim Ram. So we are completely clear to provide consulting services out of our consulting group and verification services out of our audit program.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Oh, yes, and Jim. Thank you.
Thanks, Natasha. And I appreciate what Kathy had to say there, and I just want to send a real clear signal to the industries that EcoEngineers is going to be both a modeler and an auditor. And we believe that our engineering expertise and our modeling expertise and our regulatory expertise is going to combine to provide some good options and alternatives for the industry, some efficient programs for the industry. And we're going to do this making sure that we have real good communication with CARB on their approval of our conflict of interest determination.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Jim. So I had a question around whether or not the party that does the validation and whether the same entity can do verification. Does anyone have any input on that? You know, I think our best understanding currently is that you can do validation and verification because they are both CARB-owned processes that are going to be led by CARB. So whereas, you know, to look at a different type of audit, say an internal audit, that would be a high level of conflict, whereas validation is a CARB-owned process, as is verification. So our current understanding is that, you know, a verification body could complete both for the same entity, and I'm seeing a lot of nods, which I like. Awesome. Okay, so let's read. So if a tier 2 pathway needs validation, does that mean CARB will be doing site visits during 2019? So no, CARB, well, I should never say no. I would say to the best of our understanding, CARB has not done site visits. That's not to say they haven't done site visits, but not in our experience at this moment. But that is a required part of the process come 2020. Anything to add to that? No? Okay. All right, we're getting a little specific. Okay, so is the monitoring plan developed by the producer, verification body, or both? Does anyone want to take that one?
Yeah, well, the monitoring plan is developed by the reporting party or the importer of the fuel. They're the ones that are going to be, and whoever the credit generator is developing the monitoring plan and responsible for putting that together.
Also, every fuel producing facility will need to do that for biofuels. For the biofuel space, if you're a production facility and not a reporting entity, you'll also need a monitoring plan. Basically, any party that's required to contract for verification services must have a monitoring plan.
Including feedstock suppliers?
If you were a joint applicant feedstock supplier, you would need to have a monitoring plan. That's right.
Well,
yeah, and you know, just to give a little more color around the monitoring plan. So the monitoring plan, the intention is for the verification body to look at your monitoring plan and be able to understand what they have to verify as part of their verification process. So whatever it is a part of your facility, anything unique, this is your chance to tell the verification body about it. It's intended to be a living document that's updated regularly, and you know, in the regulation, it does state that CARB can request it, but it doesn't have to be submitted, you know, with your pathway application. But, you know, our recommendation is have it on hand because you never know when CARB might ask for it.
and how will the verifier use the monitoring plan?
Yeah, so, you know, our understanding right now is that the verification body will look at the monitoring plan and create their sampling plan and verification plan based off of the information in there. You know, one thing that's really important to remember as a difference between LCFS and the RFS is that all the pathways are very facility specific under LCFS. So anything unique about your facility is going to be verified. So giving the producers an opportunity to detail that, that's really what the monitoring plan is about.
And Natasha, I understand another really important part of that monitoring plan is your carbon intensity score.
Yes, absolutely. I would say, you know, when you're thinking about your monitoring plan, think about all the inputs into your carbon intensity. Think about the type of information, the depth of information you produced for your application. Think to that level. Anything else to add on that in here? All right. Okay, so one other question around the the selection of a verification body. So does the pathway applicant choose the verification body, or does CARB assign a verification body? So, you know, there is some choice to the pathway applicant and the pathway holder. They can, you know, choose to work with a verification body, but that partnership has to be approved by CARB. So, you know, at EcoEngineers, we're working through conflict of interest with clients that we have done a bit of work for. We want to make sure that when we go to CARB and we're saying we want to complete verification for these entities, that we know exactly what that conflict of interest is and we're prepared to mitigate for it here. Anything from anyone?
No, I think that's also why we mentioned earlier about starting this process early and starting to contact and talk with who you want to be a verifier, because as Randy mentioned, that official conflict of interest, we put that together here and that goes to CARB for approval. And so we'll know directly from CARB what that conflict is it 3 years or 6 years? So starting that process now is a good thing to do, just to get ahead of the game as you're looking to 2020 as the first verification year.
Yeah, and to confirm, I mean, that's the conflict of interest determination process. It's part of the process, and it's a formal process, and an official letter needs to be drafted and submitted to the executive director at CARB for review and then approval. So it's a formal process, and it's not too soon to start that process.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Okay, so this is interesting, and maybe, Brad, this is very RNG specific. So would an RNG plant that does not generate LCFS credits need their own monitoring plan in addition to the credit generator?
I don't know. I'm not 100% sure on that. It probably depends on what the contractual arrangement is with the credit generator. Certainly that the RNG facility, since they will have really the CI score is based around that, at a minimum if they're not the credit generator, at a minimum will have to document how all of the different inputs and the tracking procedures around the carbon intensity score. But whether they maintain the monitoring plan or whether the credit generator, if they are different parties, maintains the monitoring plan, I think that's yet to be seen, is if they need them both or if it's one or other. I don't know if anyone else has any. We're still working our way through several of these specific questions on how CARB may treat the verification, since we haven't gone through the official training yet. But that's how I would interpret it until we get some more definition from CARB.
Right, I agree, Brad, and I kind of equate it to how, you know, maybe a ethanol plant is selling to a importer into California, and the importer is reporting the credits as a reporting entity, but you know, really the ethanol plant, while they're not generating the credits, are responsible for the carbon intensity and making sure. So I think there is some flexibility in, you know, the different monitoring plans and having, you know, monitoring plans specific to your responsibilities. And going back to what you said, I mean, we've seen all sorts of contractual arrangements with biogas pathways. So I think it probably comes down to what are the responsibilities under your contractual agreements with your downstream partners as well.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you both. All right. So how do we choose a verification body and have a conflict of interest review done without a CARB approved list of verification bodies? Well, I think you have a first grade step of listening to our webinar and knowing that we're hoping to be a verification body post training. But really it's, you know, it is up to you to wait and see for that list. But I do know that there are many of us, you know, cap and trade, all of us are hoping to be certified by CARB when this training does occur. But our emails are right here. We'd be more than happy to do a conflict of interest for your specific entity if you would please. All right, let's see. Oh, interesting question. Okay, so if the RNG process changes, if there are RNG process changes to improve a CI or capacity, does this call for a change with the pathway certification? So what I think is being asked is if there are process improvements to lower your CI, does that require a new application, a new pathway? And I would say that if you're going to get a lower CI, it's not required, But, I mean, it's always in your best interest to be generating credits under your lowest CI score possible while being, considerate of seasonality and many other changes. Dr. Zhizhao Wang and I are always open to talking to you about these specific scenarios and whether, in our experience, if it warrants a new pathway application, and I'd be more than happy to talk with anyone further about that.
Yeah, I think also, Natasha, on the score, it kind of depends on what do you consider major. If you're doing a major process, let's just say you're putting solar panels up to drastically lower your CI, you may want to reapply and to get that lower score immediately, because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but the score is going to be based on, is it a 24-month rolling average, Natasha?
Yep.
For your CI score. So if eventually your process improvement will make its way through that 24-month rolling average, but as Natasha said, you probably want to capture that additional value and revenue from that lower CI score immediately. So it's likely going to be in your best interest if you do major improvements to reapply. Otherwise, if you're making, say, a small bottlenecking change that might improve your score by a couple of points, that will eventually make its way through and be a part of your rolling average.
But however, this also sounds like a great example of what would trigger an update to your monitoring plan. These types
Exactly.
These types of process improvements
exactly
then would go back to the monitoring plan and you make those updates.
Yes, that is
You capture it there.
absolutely right. Let's see. Andrew, I think we have a question for you on biodiesel.
Great.
So for biodiesel production, does the certified yield get updated with yearly reporting? In a that's that question. I'm starting to read the next one.
I'm sorry, can you repeat it for me one more time?
Not a problem. For biodiesel production, does the certified yield get updated with the annual reporting?
Now that's a great question, and I don't know the answer to that question at the moment, but I'd be happy to look into it and discuss it further with whomever the question person was.
Yeah, so send Andrew an email with your specific question and we'll talk in-house and get you a good answer on that one. All right, let's see. Okay, this might be a question for the larger group. It's a long one, so stick with me. And where did it start? In a co-processing scenario whereby an advanced liquid fuel producer provides co-processing liquid feedstock to a California refinery, would that provider need a monitoring and/or verification plan, given that it is a refinery that does generate LCFS credits? My understanding is that you would be a part of their verification process because you are providing a type of feedstock, as we have mentioned around the specified source feedstocks. However, your specific role as far as needing a monitoring plan, that's a little bit unclear because of the option you have here to be Andrew, what is that? A joint applicant, right? Or, be a part of that refinery's application. So I think that's maybe a conversation you need to have with your refinery that you're working with and see how you'd like to handle this. Anything else to add, anyone? Okay. Oh, another great question I love to answer about what EcoEngineers can help you do. So does EcoEngineers help us with getting registered with CARB? We're located out of state. Yes, we can absolutely help you get registered with CARB. Please send us an email and I'd be more than happy to talk with you a little bit more about your process, fuel, all that, and get you squared away. Okay. And I'm going to look to Lindsay. Okay, we have a couple more minutes. Okay, so with the annual verification, is it a new certified CI every year, or is it only compared to the original certified CI? So I think this question is asking, when you're being verified annually, are we comparing it to your fuel pathway code CI, the one you originally applied with, or is it, the most recent one from an annual reporting time? And what I would say, to the best of my knowledge right now, is that you will always be compared to your fuel pathway code and what is in the system for your facility. So that would be your original CI score. If during an annual verification your CI score does reduce, you do have the option for the next year to apply for that lower CI score and increase your credit generation associated with that. And I hope I answered that question with the intent that you asked it with. Anything else to add to that?
No, I think that's the best case scenario, right? If your CI score decreases and the next year you get to generate credits on that. A question that we've been asked a few times, specifically in RNG, is what if the opposite happens? What if my CI score increases during my annual review? And I think Karen mentioned this in her discussion, was you are responsible to make the market whole. And so if you basically over-generated credits for the previous year after that CI score review, I think then in your next, correct me if I'm wrong, Natasha, but I think in your next reporting cycle, you would make that reconciliation, make that whole. Not necessarily you have to pay back credits immediately, but you would rectify that in the next quarter. Is that correct?
That's my understanding right now, but I would always defer back to the regulation and say that the penalties are up to the executive officer. They're up to CARB. They will decide, with discussions with you as a producer, as a pathway holder, what those ramifications are. But yes, that's absolutely one of the ones that's mentioned in the regulation.
I think that just shows the importance of any of these producers to track what your carbon intensity score is on some regular basis, whether, maybe that's not a daily basis, but you may want to consider, checking in on that score and managing that score regularly. You don't want a big surprise come the end of the year or in your verification report if some data was not favorable to your overall score.
And I think we have time for one last question. So let's see, we'll go general, that would apply to everybody. So how do monitoring plan and verification obligations apply to provisional pathways versus certified pathways? Does anyone have an answer on that one? All right. So, our understanding right now, and please remember that it's always up to CARB, and we'll find out more during this training that they're committed to putting on by the end of the year, that the verification is associated with reports submitted to CARB. So if you are submitting quarterly reports, then you are subject to quarterly verification, like for credit generation, et cetera, et cetera. Am I wrong, Andrew?
Well, I wouldn't say you're wrong. Quarterly reports would be reviewed, but you'd still have the option to choose for a quarterly verification.
That's right.
Review, or have that done annually. Of course, those quarterly reports would all compile into the annual report.
Mm-hmm.
The difference would be how much the verifier does and when they do it for the quarterly review, as opposed to the annual review.
But with reference to provisional to certified, the requirements are the same to our understanding right now. That you have a pathway, provisional or not, you still need to have that pathway verified, and you still need to have a monitoring plan in place. Anything else to add on that?
Jim, I want to just say that, like any new regulation, and I think our experience in dealing with new regulations is that this is going to be an ongoing development for the first several years. There's going to be conversations and precedents set with CARB that are going to go industry-wide, and there's going to be a new culture of verification established, and CARB is going to work with verification bodies to bring this verification to the level that they want, and that level that they've been talking about, that was demonstrated or talked about in the webinar, was at the level of a financial audit. So they want these credits to meet that kind of level of quality. And so I think that I think that we're coming to industry with some knowledge of how the industry operates and how past regulatory frameworks have operated, and we kind of believe that we're hoping for a lot of our questions to be solidified or answered by CARB, but it may actually take a few years to iron out all these details.
And, you know, I would just note, I know we didn't get to all the questions, but please send us emails, and we'd be more than happy to start engaging with you on some further questions that you might have. And I'm going to let anyone on the panel wrap it up if they have any ending thoughts.
And I would just like to thank everybody in the audience for attending our webinar series today, the session on LCFS verification. All of our webinars are posted on our YouTube channel. You can find them there. Please remember that this session was recorded. Anybody that is registered for the webinar will receive an email with the recording. And last but not least, please know that we're working hard every day to be your LCFS verification partner. Thank you.
Awesome.